Remember last week we talked about the Transfiguration. And if we had enough time as we go through, there's a really rich study of the Transfiguration as it's recorded by Matthew and as it's recorded by Mark, and to notice different things that they look at that's unique to each one of them regarding the Transfiguration. We don't have time to make that comparison, but I want to point out a couple of highlights from last week's lesson that are critical as we continue going through the book of Matthew. You may remember that when Jesus is transfigured before them, Peter is overwhelmed by this. And Matthew doesn't say this, but Mark does. When Peter said, Lord, let me go ahead and build a little shelter for you and one for Elijah and one for Moses. And in parenthesis in the Gospel of Mark, it says, because Peter didn't really know what to say. So he just blurts this out, that this would be his response. And as a result of that, Jesus says, or while he's saying that, then there's this big white cloud that just envelops them. And a voice that repeats almost word for word what Jesus heard at his baptism. And if you listen to the words, this is my son whom I love, with him I'm well pleased. Now, that's the same wording in his baptism. There's another phrase that's added, though, in this event. Listen to him. And it's interesting because as Jesus began his ministry and he was baptized, he had not been with his disciples nearly, as long as we have here up to chapter 17, had not been mentoring any of them, had not been in full-blown ministry mode all over Galilee and the surrounding areas, but now he has. It's later in his ministry. And think about why God felt the need for Peter, James, and John, as they're at the Mount of Transfiguration, as they are there around Jesus, the need for them to hear, listen to him. Think about probably other voices they were listening to, other things that were disturbing their view of what they thought the kingdom ought to be. How worked up they were getting over various things that weren't going the direction they thought they ought to be going. And as a result of that, listen to him. Now, think about what that means for discipleship. And I want to explore this for a moment. When we began this study, we made a clear distinction on how to approach the Gospels. And sometimes we don't intentionally recognize this, but it's really crucial. When we open up and study the Gospels, we're looking at it on three levels all at once. The first level is the historical level. What was Jesus doing when he was alive here on earth? The second one that we tend to forget is what I call the early church level. Matthew composed, by the involvement of the Spirit, this narrative, this gospel about Jesus for his church. The church that Matthew knew was the original audience for this gospel. Now, for those of us who live in this day and time, we have to ask questions like, okay, what was the early church? Let's say it's in the 60s that Matthew writes this. What was the early church struggling with that they could get a word of encouragement from this gospel to hear the word, listen to him? Very important, very important. And so today, as we're trying to be disciples and we read through the gospel, we come to this point. What does it mean for us to hear the words, listen to him? It's simple, but it's also pretty profound and powerful. Listen to him. And I think I may have mentioned this once. I don't think that we realize how many different philosophies and religions are options for people today. There's a ton of them. When I was doing some research a few years ago at the UT Library, and I can't remember the name of the set, but it was something like World Spiritualities, and it was almost like an encyclopedia set. And if I remember right, there were probably 11 volumes in that set. And each volume was supposed to represent sort of the major religion, and of course, all of its different variations. For example, one volume I think was on Buddhism. I think there was one on Islam. But you had, and here's what the strange thing was. I'm looking through all of this, and in the set, there was one for Christianity, but it was the thinnest volume. The rest of them were pretty thick, which as you flip through them, you recognized Christianity doesn't have a copyright on schisms and groups and divisions and different ways of thinking and groups that fight against each other. We don't have a copyright on that. Any of the world religions have that same dynamic. But I think what sort of shocked me was to realize Christianity has never had the luxury of existing in a vacuum. When people hear the word of Christ, they also have way too many other options they can listen to also. Let me tell you where an experience I had really pointed that out for me about what people hear and the challenge they have of hearing the gospel. I was in a classroom setting where the teacher, and remember back a few years ago, this is going to date all of us in here. How many of you remember getting on a frequent basis the TV guide? Remember the TV guide? Okay, that's dating us. Here's what the teacher did. We went into the classroom, and it just so happened there were 7 of us in the class. So he took the TV guide. He started on Sunday, and he tore out the page for the primetime class shows between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. And I'm one of the 7, so he hands me the pages on Sunday. Well, the next person gets the 2 pages of all of those shows on Monday. So he gave each one of us the primetime listings. And of course, if you remember, when it would give the shows, it'd be a little tagline, so you could kind of see what was going on. So what he did was, and it was interesting because the room was filled with whiteboards. The whole room had a whiteboard around it. So each one of us, I started over here on Sunday. Next person beside me was Monday, so we went around the room that way. We all listed on the whiteboard both the program that was coming on that evening, and we listed what was said in the tagline for each one of those shows. And some of those taglines are pretty graphic. And I guess the reason they got used to wording them that way, they wanted you to read that and with that 1 or 2 sentence, grab you so you could watch the show. When we got done, we stood in the middle of the room, and we just looked around, just very quietly reading everything around the room. And I'll never forget that the teacher said, I want you to look at this. Those of you who are in ministry and trying to preach, you're competing with all of this. That just blew me away. And Christianity has always been that way. Other ways of thinking, other ways of looking at the world, other ways of right and wrong, other ways of treating people. I mean, you could just name it. There it was, all around us, and I've never forgotten that to this day. It is no wonder that the gospel has a hard time getting a hearing. The competing voices are very loud, and there's a ton of them. And so what we have to pray is 2 things. When we hear this word, listen to him, we have to ask God to give us patience when people aren't listening the way we think they ought to, okay? And then number 2, that God through his Spirit will help open people's minds and ears so they can listen to him. Does any of this make sense? I mean, this is the culture in which we live. Way too many competing voices out there. And what I've discovered is when I study the Bible with either new converts or people wanting to come to Christ, they've already heard a ton of other voices. And we cannot take for granted anymore that the average person coming to Christ knows a lot about the Bible. They don't. They really don't. And that's why those of us who are older, as I get older, I feel this real compunction on my heart that I really need to be sharing with younger adults. When I can see that they're not where they need to be spiritually, I need to step up my game and start praying with them, studying the Bible with them, helping them understand the Christian worldview. It doesn't take you long to go to the movies or turn TV on, and you can see the Christian worldview is not what's being promoted by Hollywood. Now, there are some movies coming out and have that promoted, but that's not the dominant ones. So anyway, I can keep on lathering on that. Anybody want to say anything before we move on this? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. I like your distinction. Here's what I want to do with this, David. In the Gospel of Matthew, the reason Jesus gets into so much trouble is because he's challenging current day religion. And that religion is made up of rituals that actually replaced, that's probably a good word, actually replaced their relationship with God. They assumed that right ritual was the relationship. It's not. It's almost like, I want you to think about this image. It's almost like a couple celebrating their anniversary and either one or both of them thinking if they could just make the anniversary dinner perfect in all of its details, then our marriage is okay. And then they don't nurture that relationship for another year. Okay, next year comes. Here comes our anniversary dinner. Make sure everything is just perfect. You know, all kinds of table etiquette, and we're talking nice to each other. You got the ritual down. Well, the anniversary dinner's over the next year. You know, you don't nurture the relationship, but you can't wait for the ritual next year. And when you start thinking about that and just see how absurd that is, ridiculous, that's the approach people have taken about religion. You're exactly right. Any other comments? That was really good. Thank you, Dave. That was really good. Okay, let's continue going then in Matthew 17:14. Let me read from 14 down through 23 and follow along. When they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. "Lord, have mercy on my son," he said. "He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him." "O unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed from that moment. Then the disciples came to Jesus in private, and they asked him, Why couldn't we drive it out?" And he replied, "Because you have so little faith. I tell you the truth, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life." And the disciples were filled with grief. Both in Matthew and Mark, there are several places where Jesus warns his disciples ahead of time that he's going to have to suffer and die. And it seems like at every time that he does that, either they don't get it or they're filled with grief and they don't want it. They don't want that to happen. And of course, that's pretty natural. They're spending time with him. They don't want to even think about Jesus not being there. But he's trying to prepare them. He's trying to warn them and for that time. As we read this, there's a couple things with this healing of the boy with the demon. Let's talk a moment about demon possession. There is so much good material on it. We could spend 6 months studying this. I mean, it's just, let me give you both ends of the spectrum, and probably realize that in the middle is where the biblical thing is. On the one hand, there are people that will look at the New Testament, and wherever you see demon possession, they dismiss it as an ancient way of talking about physical problems. And even as this young boy we see his manifestations and his symptoms that he's struggling with. But some people would say that all that is just epilepsy. So every time there is a demonstration of demon possession, it is dismissed with the idea it's the ancient way of talking about physical illness. The other extreme, people believe there's a demon behind every tree today and in everything. There's even the belief that Satan and demons have geographical territories. I mean, it gets, I don't know if I've told this story here or not. This was several years ago. We were up in Michigan, and I noticed one day at the workout center, I was working out, exercising, and then I got in the hot tub, and it was a large one, so there were like 15 guys around the circle of this hot tub, okay? And I noticed over here on the end, this gentleman got to talking to the guy sitting beside him. Well, it wasn't long, that guy, the one beside him, got up and left. Well, he scooted over to the next guy. It wasn't long that guy got up and left. He worked himself all the way around till he finally got to me. I thought, this has got to be good. Every single person's leaving here. He was convinced that he had seen the devil and his demons, and he knew exactly what they looked like. So he was talking all this stuff about demon possession and whatever, and that God had healed him from demon possession, but he knew all of the demons' names. He knew where they lived. He knew what they looked like, and he just kept on lathering on and on. And I thought, okay, all these guys that left probably, and I knew some of them, probably didn't see themselves as very religious, okay? And so I'm sure this just blew them out of the water, almost literally. So when he got through, I think this young man's name was Bob. I said, Bob, I have listened to your story. You've told me that you've given your life to Christ. Why have you spent 99% of your time talking about Satan and his demons, and you haven't been talking about Christ? And he sat there and he's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. I said, listen, all these guys that you drove out of this room, they don't know anything about Christ. All they know is that you're focused on demons. And so I don't know if he changed his approach after that day, but I couldn't be quiet. I was like, listen, this is ridiculous. Now, in the middle, let's talk about where the middle is, and we'll probably pick up on this next week because this is fascinating. In the ancient world, there was the recognition that demons were real, very real, and all you have to do is read the literature. Now, some of the things that happened that were attributed to demons seem pretty bizarre. So there's no way of knowing if some of the things actually happened or if people thought they were seeing what happened and attributed it to demons. But in the ancient world, demons were very much alive and well, okay? And Satan probably was doing some things that we don't know about. Demon possession is still very much a part of some people's worlds, especially over in the third world. A lot of people. There's more and more people in the United States that believe it now. Probably it got really kicked into high gear after the movie The Exorcist. Now, I don't know if you all ever saw the movie, but I think in our culture, the whole idea of demon possession really got kicked into high gear after that movie. And so now what I hear people saying is, I have such and such a problem, and it's because of demon possession. Well, if they're saying that to eliminate responsibility on their part, I differ with them. Now, could Satan be up to something in a person's life? You bet. But I don't know what. But here's what I tell people, because I believe this down to the bottom of my heart, and I'm not turning loose of it. It's the one in 1 John. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And if that's true, I don't care what Satan and the demons think they're up to today. Jesus is stronger. So we've settled that discussion. Okay? Now, and so, but what I've also found is People who think that they have demon possession, probably the best thing is you got to listen to them first. If you start wading in and trying to tell them that nothing they're saying is true, they're not going to listen to you. But you need to listen to them, let them process that. But somewhere along the line, they've got to recognize that you cannot go to a default button that says demon possession eliminates from me any free will and choice and accountability and responsibility on my part. And I've seen people do that, and that's what bothers me. Now, and see, again, that's what we find in the New Testament about demon possession. That is interesting. And this little boy demonstrates this. Sometimes the demons have their way with human beings, and the human beings can't do anything about it. Here's another thing about demons. I believe, I got to go back and check, I think there's 2 episodes in the Old Testament of demon possession, and that's it. In Jesus' ministry, all of a sudden, demons are everywhere. He's confronting them everywhere. After he ascends back into heaven, I think there's 1 or 2 episodes in Acts about demon possession, and that's it. So it's almost like you got 2 little blips on the radar screen over here. Jesus comes on the scene, it's like, whoa! And then when Jesus ascends back into heaven, 2 more little blips, and that's it. So you go, okay, now what's going on? Well, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to realize that when Jesus was here on earth, Satan unleashed everything he had to try and destroy who Jesus was. To me, it's just as clear as a bell. And so this whole thing of demon possession, I think we don't need to worry about it. And I do believe Satan is up to things that we don't know about, but I also believe God's stronger than Satan, so I don't worry about that part of it. But also people who claim that they're possessed by demons. And here's the interesting thing. You can go online, and there are ministries based on exorcisms. I'm aware of that. What all that means and how much God is a part of that, I don't have any way of gauging that or trying to measure if it's truly God at work or not. I don't know what to do with that. But again, God has the last say in all of this. What is interesting is, notice how Jesus responds to his disciples. Because they said, you know, we couldn't drive the demon out. You did. So what's the problem? I mean, they're really intrigued by this. Jesus says, because you have so little faith. I think it's 5 times in Matthew, he says to his disciples, oh, you have little faith. And they're in a journey of learning what it means to be disciples of great faith instead of little faith. Well, another thing, and I'll close here in a minute with this, we've talked about this before. What is so amazing about Jesus, he is willing to work with guys that he knows has little faith. That's a tremendous lesson for us. When we interact with people and we want them to come to Jesus, we have to understand most of the time that starting point for them is a place of little faith. But that's okay. God can work with little faith. He didn't say you have no faith. He didn't say that. He said you have little faith. Okay? So, we have to be very careful in expecting people to be exactly where we are with our faith. And if we're working with them and they have little faith, that's okay. Jesus worked with people with little faith. We can too. And we have to be willing to. And we have to ask God to use us to impact the lives of people who have little faith. Because what you see in the lives of the disciples here is after 3 years, took 3.5 years, for them to get to the point so that the day of Pentecost could happen, and now they are men and women of a lot greater faith than they were 3 years earlier when Jesus says, you have little faith. Let's pick up again at this point next week. This is such a neat part of Matthew because Jesus is getting at the heart again of discipleship. Thank you all for being here this morning.